Every adventure needs an ancient, weathered map. At the front of the book, in the hands of the protagonist, the map is painstakingly drawn, with just the right amount of detail to help our heroes, but not solve everything. We've seen them in books and films for years, charts of the mysterious islands, sketches of the mountains, the treasure maps. But you never get to meet the map makers. In this video, we'll go into the basics that you need to consider when creating location maps for your world. Not only the basics of what to draw, but how to make your maps look good enough to hang them on your wall. Welcome, adventurers. I'm Ryan of the Red Quills, and I'll be your cartographic tutor as we delve into the world on the page. Today, we'll be combining the principles of the last several videos, and I'll point out the relevant tutorials as we pass, but our aim is to create a map that you can put in the front of your book or hand to your players very early on to lead to a final confrontation. I'll be drawing, painting, and inking a map of my own to show you the principles as we go. This is the map of Old Gvanlar's Hall, the lair of the dragon, Axabar the Vain. As always, we want to start with a blank page. With any site map, it's important to note that you'll want to be purposeful from the beginning. For this map, I want it to stand out as much as possible, so I'll be combining several mediums from the last few videos, and I will have a site map, several illustrations, a sketch of the dragon itself, and I'll fill the blank spaces with information about the lore and the contents of the hall. With that in mind, I'll make a pencil sketch. I'll rule out a 1-inch border, the basic shapes of the overview, the illustrations, and the sketches, and make sure that I quickly write out the major labels as well. And because I'm using several media, I'll start with the watercoloring. In my previous video, How to Draw a Naturalist Map, I used watercolor on several aspects, but one of the simpler but more rewarding aspects was the outline that I painted on the overhead view of the drifting isle. In this case, I want it to be eye-catching and aesthetic again, so I'll be using a simple brown watercolor as an outline to the complex cave system, and then inking a thicker line later on to add exactitude. The process is quite simple. You'll need some water, a palette of watercolors, and a brush of the correct thickness. For the best results in this map, I used 3 thicknesses of paint. Using the water, prepare the area that you want to color by painting it with water. Not too much, just enough to show a slight sheen. You can experiment with this to find a method that works for you. Once you've wet the paper, you can separate the small portion of your water and add the watercolor to it for a moderate amount of color. To get the effect that I have in this video, add the paint on the edge of the primed area, as the watercolor will spread onto the wet area, but stop at the dry. That way the colors will fade in one direction. I've also used a much more concentrated color in a fine line on the edge to really make that fade pop. Now I'm going to go through and paint the entire cave system, which is going to take some time. So while I'm doing that, I'll discuss why it's important to create these maps for your campaign. In previous videos, particularly in the realm map videos that I've made, such as the How to Create Trade Maps tutorial, we've created maps that are purely functional. I go into some of the techniques, insights, and details to create a map that your readers or players can use for their own purposes, and the effort that you can put into them will reward both them and you. They help to write, to plan, to explain, and to create new ideas. But encounter maps are different. They're only of one small location, and the smaller size extrapolates to a relatively small practical use. A map of a kingdom can be used for as long as your heroes are in that kingdom, which may be weeks, months, or even years. But a map of a single location will only really be useful for one trip, which is why they're really only practical to create for singularly important encounters, symbolic locations, areas of personal significance, or the final destinations. Stories are told because they allow the reader to explore themselves in some way, perhaps their history, the perspective of the universe, or the unanswered questions that they struggle with in their own lives. They allow us to search for meaning, and so it's fitting that they should use a map for that search. Symbolic locations in fantasy are places associated with a particularly strong theme, one that makes us want to linger and spend more time there. Places like Rivendell in The Lord of the Rings, or the Vale of Alder in the Belgariad, are symbolic locations that represent the kind of peace and tranquility that the heroes are fighting to defend, whilst encapsulating how little they really know about the world. Having a map of such significant locations brings that area to mind for your reader. It allows them, encourages them even, to linger there in their thoughts. It can be a strong and compelling tool to foster introspection. Everyone fights for something, and if that something is a place, perhaps some quaint round doors beneath a tidy green hill, then their minds will go back there often. They'll dream about that place, speak of it often, reflect on the things that they took for granted, and they will wish, more than anything, that they were back there. If they carry a map of that place, they'll take it out to look at it often, their fingers tracing over the lines of their familiar lanes and roads, their eyes staring at the page, but seeing the rivers and the woods of their homes. It's a statement to carry in dark places. This is what we're fighting for. The most important and obvious use for an encounter map like this is the final destination. The heroes are thinking of doing something valiant and probably hopeless, but by chance encounter an ancient weathered map is delivered to them. It shows not only their destination, but some secret that will make their task possible. Though they'll only spend a matter of days, possibly weeks, possibly hours at that location, their minds will be going towards that place, filling the page and its careful labels with dread and terror. They wake in the night, filled with fear, and pull the map out to reassure themselves that what they seek to do is possible. But remember, all maps have to be useful as maps. When creating your encounter map, strike a balance between that aesthetic and the practicality that all maps must have. Take a look at this map and we'll discuss. The Dragon's Lair is an old dwarven hall, not particularly original, I know, but this is just an example. The hall is a complex array of chambers and halls and several entrances to the mountainside. The arrival of the dragon, however, has caused the bedrock to shift. A large crack has shorn away at the north side of the complex, destroying several hallways, yes, but opening up a way inside for those brave enough to crawl into it. The map then is practical. It's a simple 2-scale overview of the hall and its chambers, its entrances and exits, and any landmarks on the way. It has 2 illustrations of the landmarks that you'll encounter, a view of the front door, and a view looking down the hallway that leads to the Dragon's Lair. Both of these are not only aesthetic, but very useful. Now the reader knows exactly what to look for when trying to get into the hall. Now, I have a sketch of the dragon. The sketch is slightly different in style from the illustrations, the reason being that the dragon became aware that he was being watched before the mapmaker could finish, but it shows what an interloper is looking for. If they encounter a dragon that does not look like that, then they are truly in trouble. All of these are aesthetic, but they are first and foremost functional. Each aspect can be used by someone attempting to go to and enter the hall, and they all look good. When designing your own map, always ask yourself whether the aspects that you have are both practical and aesthetic. Let's head back to the map and see how I'm getting on. In a previous video, How to Draw Your Dungeons, I talked about how to draw your dungeons, but the purpose was creating a dungeon map that was mainly useful to you, the creator of the world. I added a few more illustrations there than was strictly necessary, but I did actually end up using that map in my own Dungeons & Dragons campaign as a guide to allow my players to explore the still beating heart. In this case, the map is ideally going to be given to your audience, your players, your readers, etc., and so you want to make sure that you create something that you're proud of. That map was fairly simple to create, if not necessarily easy. It only used ink, for example, rather than the combination of mediums and styles that I have here. So let's get into a little bit more about the how-to of creating the maps, as well as the content creation of what to give to your audience to strike a balance between too little and too much. Admittedly, on this channel, I tend not to question the why of map making very often. I could talk for hours about the benefits of having a map, how they can positively impact on your world building, immersion, and writing cohesion, but it is a lot of effort to go to for a functional drawing. Each of the maps that I make on this channel take me several hours, and your own will probably take you about that long too. My process is often to experiment as I go, because the next time that I make a map, I'll alter it to include the lessons that I learned from my experimentations in the previous iteration. For instance, I'll be painting the main titles on this map because it was an idea that I had during my last video, but most people probably won't have the time to make map after map after map and change things as they go. Which brings me to this point. If you're creating a map, you need to be clear before you set pen to paper of what it is that the map is really pointing to. What's the purpose of the map? Is it a player handout, the inset to a publication, or for personal reference? Maybe they're a gift for your 100th session, or a memorabilia for a long-running story. The steps are pretty simple. Firstly, you have to figure out what your map is pointing to specifically. When you know what you want your reader to focus on, you can work out the details around it. Secondly, you choose the style that you want. Do you want illustrations or the watercolor effect that I'm using here? Divide the page into the areas that you want and then figure out what text you're going to add in later. Thirdly, add in the secrets and the clues. Every single map that I make has a secret hidden somewhere inside it, a clue or a reference to a piece of world building or lore that I have tried to hide in plain sight. You could design a decorative border that contains a code or add in some symbols to mark important points. I'll talk about the why of that later, but it's something to think about early on. Whatever you do with your map, be clear and have purpose. Always ask yourself what the vibe you want to strike is. It comes from asking yourself what the purpose of the map is. But we've covered all manner of different kinds of maps so far on this channel. Kingdom maps, trade maps, maps of culture, maps of significant sites, naturalist maps, blueprints for heists. All of them have a different style based on their intention. All of them can be made to look aesthetic, though they may have different aesthetics. You can either come in with one in mind, or you ask yourself, who's making this map in world? Is it an exiled prince, a pirate seeking to hide her gold, an archaeologist scrawling their notes, or a botanist on an expedition? When you ask what would they look for, what details would they notice, it will tell you what your map will focus on. A botanist will wander into a cave system to look for fungi. A pirate will make notes of reefs or shallows and rumours of wrecks. An exiled prince would know where the patrols of the border would be and the secret paths to the capital. Then you can start to create the map itself, filling it with the details and the points of reference that you want to include. I've talked about how to draw realm maps before, and I recently released a tutorial on creating city and town maps. And I've also spoken about dungeon generation before, but I'll mention the bare bones again while I'm here. The process for filling any map with details is always based on the same principles of scale. For instance, a city is 4 towns pushed together, and a town is 3 villages pushed together. When you know that, you have a brief list of what landmarks each of those settlement sizes will have, and then you just need to divide your city into 4 districts, towns, and each of those districts into 3 neighborhoods, villages. For complexes like this, the process is similar, and you use the same kind of scales. I'm a big fan of the 5-chamber process. The idea is there's 5 kinds of chamber that you can encounter in a complex, or combinations of the two. You can have ambience, environmental dangers, dead ends, puzzles, and encounters, and that's great. But it's only 5 chambers after all, and this map has far more than that. So the process is simple. You think big and then divide. The complex as a whole has 5 parts: the ambience entrance area, the environmental danger of the forge and the foundry, the dead end of the living quarters, the puzzle of the rift, and the encounter in the dragon's lair. Then you divide each of those 5 parts into 5 chambers again, and flavor them according to their scenes, adding ancillary rooms to flesh out the details. That's my method for creating large-scale thematic complexes that maintain a level of intrigue and viability for exploration. Once the map itself has been completed, you've determined what it looks like, you've generated the contents of the dungeon crawl with your own methods, and you have something that's complex, dangerous, and will entertain your adventurers. You can look at filling out the other details. As mentioned, many of the aspects that I've included in this map are directly useful to people on the ground. The map itself, the views of the entrance and the atrium, the sketch of the dragon, but what can you add to a map if you're running out of ideas? What details will be beneficial and add depth? First and foremost, the start of anything that I add to a map is a history of the location that I'm sketching. Now there's a good reason for that. The history of the place will not only tell you who might be there now, but also the style of architecture, the dangers that they'll have placed, the relevant style of the puzzles and the mysteries that you can encounter. When talking about the history of an area, I use the original method, writing something about each one of these topics. When you've got 1 or 2 sentences on each, you'll be able to populate the borders of a map, and it will also be an invaluable tool to creating some world building. Origins. Whether the founding of the site is shrouded in myth or a set purpose in history, always begin with a reference to how it started, who founded it, and for what purpose. The rise and fall. You don't need to go into a blow-by-blow description of everything that's happened throughout the long history of your site, but giving a brief description of when it was in its golden era will shape its current state. Seeing as we deal with the ruins a lot in our fantasy worlds, I also include the fall in this topic. Inhabitants. Discuss the original settlers who lived or live at this place and what to expect as a traveller. Are they open to outsiders, a xenophobic cult, or strange otherworldly magicians? Goods. This one may seem a little boring, but bear with me. If you add in a sentence or two about a specific good that's significant to the locals, it will come up again. Trust me. Just adding in something about how they clad all of their buildings in white marble or lined their avenues with cypress trees. It can be an import or an export. It can be purely decorative. Add something in. Industries. As economists never stop reminding us, trade is the lifeblood of civilization. So, what was the industry here? Every settlement will have to produce something in order to be connected to the outside world, and even more if it's not connected. Give the location a focused industry. In this case, at the hall, the industry was metallic refinement. Nature. Adding in a sentence or two about the nature within and around the site also gives you more to work with. What's the surrounding landscape like? Allies and enemies. You've discussed a fair amount about the inhabitants and what their lives might have been like. So a brief sentence or two describing the most significant official relationship would be very beneficial to you, either friendly or unfriendly. And lastly, add in some legends. You can give it a myth or an origin story about its beginnings, its ends, its as of yet unfulfilled purpose. Give it a little bit more of an unknown quantity after being so specific with everything else. Another aspect that you can add to your maps is a puzzle to solve, to encourage the reader to linger on the page and consider the site for longer. People have an incessant need to solve problems, so it's an easy way to keep them interested. The puzzle could be a riddle, a code, or a pattern that leads to a solution of a problem. It could be a mystery that you've woven into the history, an unknown quantity that you refer to in the layout of the complex itself. Another excellent way of creating a puzzle is the heist blueprint. You create the problems of getting inside to a secure location without being detected or stopped. Adding in details of patrols, traps, or surveillance will also add to this. A good way of inviting the interest in the speculation and the solving of these mysteries is one of my consistently favorite things to add to a map. When writing in the borders of a map, adding to the history and tucking notes into the margins, you can write from the perspective of the map maker that they have found something that they would rather not know and cannot discuss, that they only figured it out because they looked at the map as a whole and realized something. Make those words easy to spot and just watch the interest rise. The last of the 3 extras that I tend to add in is a personal touch. The map makers of my maps always add in their own personal experiences in some way or another. In this map, it's the unfinished dragon sketch, as he was detected before he could finish. In the previous map, it was a diary of his experiences on the drifting isle. Writing in a few short paragraphs, they can be untidy compared to the rest of the map, to say what they were expecting, what they found, and what they were currently afraid of, can really elevate a feeling of immersion. Now this one seems like an overly obvious topic. A map is used to plan a journey or help when you get lost. That's fairly easy to ascertain. But as a map maker who uses maps a great deal in his world building, I also know the struggle of creating a detailed and helpful map that then never gets looked at again. So let's get into how you can get more use out of your maps based on my experiences. The secret is to include information that's not obvious at the first glance but can come up later, and then let's divide it into 3 categories: enemy, destination, or mystery. A point of interest, if you're playing a role-playing game or even writing a fantasy story, to anyone who is struggling to get your protagonists to strategize is: you cannot plan without meeting your enemy, seeing their strengths and their weaknesses for yourself. But if they meet their enemy and realize early on that they are completely and totally outmatched, then they're going to need more information that they can get their hands on without risking their necks. And where would they get that information? Why, right here. If your map deals with the lair of the big bad or the evil civilization's headquarters, then you have a wonderful opportunity to add in some clues about their strengths and weaknesses, some insights into how to defeat them. Add in some first-hand accounts, descriptions of physical limitations, or even prophecies about their defeat, but remember to make them subtle. I have a few in this map, for instance, and none would stand out too much. I refer to the dragon as Aksabar the Vain. I point out that he's large and clumsy, having broken the mountainside and being unable to enter the foundry halls, and that he happily uses a small horde of kobolds as his guard. All 3 of these things imply weaknesses, either physical or mental. The dragon has limitations that the adventurers can exploit to defeat him. There are more as well, but those are the main 3 in this particular map. You can also discuss the destination itself and what to expect when you get there. If your protagonists are heading to a faraway location to steal something or confront someone, then knowing something about where they're headed is always useful. The best advice I can offer on this is to create a cryptic and basically very unhelpful warning. Something just clear enough to make them wary, but not so clear that they're certain what they know what the threat is. Couching it in evocative terms or phrasing it like a riddle does wonders for this. For example, you could make a very obvious crack run right through the mountain from the exterior to the dragon's lair and have, in a very small, neat note next to it, the sentence: "The dragon does not guard this entrance into the mountain, for the darkness smells of the abyssad, and only clears for a time on the night of the full moon." What does that mean? What's the abyssad? Why is it worse than fighting your way through a horde of kobolds? They don't know, but they'll want to find out. Both of the previous aspects had an element of this involved. People love a mystery, and they love solving a mystery. If they're looking forward to an encounter to a big bad evil guy or a final destination, then they will pull the map out whenever they want to discuss that. But another way of involving them earlier is to pull a theme forward so that it can be resolved there. And there's all manner of ways to do this, having curses associated with the place, prophecies about oncoming heroes, warnings about gods or demons. The rule is that it has to be cryptic. You could just write, "3 great tragedies befall any wanderer heading here, with the greatest to be suffered at the very doors." It could be a complete lie, but it's worth remembering. Alright, let's take a look at the map as a whole now. The sketch of Old Gvanlar's Hall with the map of the complex, the illustrations, the entrance hall and the atrium, and the sketch of Aksabar the Vain. The scrawled history of the hall and its unwanted denizens. I also have the notes on the guard movements and traps on the interior as well, for anyone who wishes to try to sneak in. As always, I have this map available on my journal for anyone who wants to download it. The link is in the description below, along with a list of materials that I've used and the link to my commission page. If you want a map like this of your own, if you don't have the time to do it yourself, then you can send me a message or take a look at my website. I try to come out with a video every week. Check out last week's video, How to Draw a Naturalist Map, if you haven't already. Thank you to everyone for watching, and I'll catch you all next week.